Holy shit. What you are about to hear me read is a stunning story of unprecedented incompetence from the unprecedentedly incompetent Trump administration in a way which threatened national security. The long story short is the Trump administration, at the highest level, you're going to see some names you recognize, created a security breach when they accidentally texted their sensitive war plans to a journalist. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. Folks, this story is stunning. It's by Atlantic journalist Jeffrey Goldberg. The title, The Trump Administration Accidentally Texted Me Its War Plans. U.S. national security leaders included me in a group text about the upcoming military strikes in Yemen. I didn't think it could be real. Then the bombs started falling. Okay, now remember, keep this in mind, that the same people, the same party that screwed up on this unprecedented scale, used to complain about Hillary Clinton's emails. Oh my God, you risk national security with Benghazi and the emails, Hillary Clinton. You put this stuff on a private server, it could have been like sent out into the ether. And these same people texted war plans to a journalist. Here we go, brace yourselves. The world found out shortly before 2 p.m. Eastern Time on March 15th that the United States was bombing Houthi targets across Yemen. I, however, knew 2 hours before the first bombs exploded that the attack might be coming. The reason I knew this is that Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, had texted me the war plan at 11:44 a.m. The plan included precise information about weapons packages, targets, and timing. This is going to require some explaining. The story technically begins shortly after the Hamas invasion of southern Israel on October 23rd. The Houthis, an Iran-backed terrorist organization whose motto is God is great, death to America, death to Israel, curse on the Jews, victory to Islam, soon launched attacks on Israel and on international shipping, creating havoc for global trade. Throughout 2024, the Biden administration was ineffective in countering these Houthi attacks. The incoming Trump administration promised a tougher response. This is where Pete Hegseth and I come in. On Tuesday, March 11th, I received a connection request on Signal from a user identified as Michael Waltz. Signal is an open-source encrypted messaging service popular with journalists and others who seek more privacy than other text messaging services are capable of delivering. I assumed that the Michael Waltz in question was Donald Trump's national security advisor. I did not assume, however, that the request was from the actual Michael Waltz. I've met him in the past, and though I didn't find it particularly strange that he might be reaching out to me, I did think it was somewhat unusual given the Trump administration's contentious relationship with journalists and Trump's periodic fixation on me specifically. It immediately crossed my mind that someone could be masquerading as Waltz in order to somehow entrap me. It's not at all uncommon these days for nefarious actors to try to induce journalists to share information that could be used against them. I accepted the connection request, hoping that this was the actual national security advisor and that he wanted to chat about Ukraine or Iran or some other important matter. 2 days later, Thursday at 4:28 p.m., I received notice that I was to be included in a Signal chat group. It was called the Houthi PC Small Group. A message to the group from Michael Waltz read as follows. Quote, team, establishing a principals group for coordination on Houthis, particularly over the next 72 hours. My deputy, Alice Wong, is pulling together a Tiger team at Deputy's Agency Chief of Staff level, following up from the meeting in the Situation Room this morning for action items, and will be sending that out later this evening. The message continued, please provide the best staff POC from your team for us to coordinate with over the next couple days and over the weekend. Thanks. The term Principals Committee generally refers to a group of the senior-most national security officials, including the Secretaries of Defense, State, and Treasury, as well as the Director of the CIA. It should go without saying, but I'll say it anyway, that I have never been invited to a White House Principals Committee meeting, and that, in my many years of reporting on national security matters, had I ever even heard of one being convened over a commercial messaging app. 1 minute later, a person identified only as Mar, the Secretary of State as Marco Antonio Rubio, wrote, quote, Mike Needham for State, apparently designating the current counselor of the State Department as his representative. At that same moment, a Signal user identified as J.D. Vance wrote Andy Baker for VP. 1 minute after that, TG, presumably Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence, or someone masquerading as her, wrote Joe Kent for DNI. 9 minutes later, Scott B., apparently Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, or someone spoofing his identity, wrote Dan Katz for Treasury. At 4:53 p.m., a user called Pete Hegseth wrote Dan Caldwell for DOD. And at 6:34 p.m., Brian wrote Brian McCormick for NSC. One more person responded, John Ratcliffe, wrote at 5:24 p.m. with the name of a CIA official to be included in the group. I'm not publishing that name because that person is an active intelligence officer. So great use of journalistic ethics here, right? Some sensibility, especially coming from a national security reporter. He does not want to, out an active intelligence officer, which could endanger national security, the intelligence officer in question, and potentially Goldberg himself. The principals had apparently assembled. In all, 18 individuals were listed as members of this group, including various national security officials, Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump's Middle East and Ukraine negotiator, Susie Wiles, the White House chief of staff, and someone identified only as SM, which I took to stand for Stephen Miller, the deputy White House chief of staff in charge of policy. That's the ogre that works for Donald Trump, who's in charge for the most inhumane practices of Donald Trump with respect to national security and immigration. I appeared on my own screen only as JG. That was the end of the Thursday text change. After receiving the Wall's text related to the Houthi PC small group, I consulted a number of colleagues. We discussed the possibility that these texts were part of a disinformation campaign initiated by either a foreign intelligence service or, more likely, a media gadfly organization, the sort of group that attempts to place journalists in embarrassing positions and sometimes succeeds. I had very strong doubts that this text group was real because I could not believe that the national security leadership of the United States would communicate on signal about imminent war plans. I could also not believe the national security advisor to the president would be so reckless as to include the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic in such discussions with senior U.S. officials, up to and including the vice president. The next day, things got even stranger. At 8:05 a.m. on Friday, March 14th, Michael Walls texted the group, "Team, you should have a statement of conclusions with taskings per the president's guidance this morning in your high side inboxes." High side, in government parlance, refers to the classified computer and communication systems. Quote, "State and DoD, we developed suggested notifications lists for regional allies and partners. Joint staff is sending this AM morning a more specific sequence of events in the coming days, and we will work with DoD to ensure Chief of Staff, Office of Vice President, and POTUS, President of the United States, are briefed." At this point, a fascinating policy discussion commenced. The account labeled JD Vance responded at 8:16. Quote, "Team, I'm out for the day doing an economic event in Michigan, but I think we're making a mistake." Vance was indeed in Michigan that day. The Vance account goes on to state, quote, 3% of U.S. trade runs through the Suez. 40% goes through of European trade does. There is a real risk that the public doesn't understand this or why it's necessary. The strongest reason to do this is, as POTUS noted, to send a message. The Vance account then goes on to make a noteworthy statement, considering that the vice president has not deviated publicly from Trump's position on virtually any issue. Quote, "I'm not sure the president is aware of how inconsistent this is with his message on Europe right now. There's a further risk that we see a moderate to severe spike in oil prices. I'm willing to support the consensus of the team and keep these concerns to myself, but there is a strong argument for delaying this a month, doing the messaging work on why this matters, seeing where the economy is, etc." So here you have the vice president in this group publicly, or rather two top Trump officials, privately deviating from Trump and saying that Trump doesn't understand the consequences of this, which is probably a fair statement to make given Donald Trump's legendary stupidity. But this continues. A person identified in Signal as Joe Kent, Trump's nominee to run the National Counterterrorism Center is named Joe Kent, wrote at 8:22, quote, "There is nothing time-sensitive driving this timeline. We'll have the exact same options in a month." Then at 8:26 a.m., a message landed in my Signal app from the user, John Radcliffe. The message contained information that might be interpreted as related to actual and current intelligence operations. At 8:27, a message arrived from Pete Hegseth's account. Quote, "VP, I understand your concerns and fully support you raising with POTUS. Important considerations, most of which are tough to know how they play out. Economy, Ukraine peace, Gaza, etc. I think messaging is going to be tough no matter what. Nobody knows who the Houthis are, which is why we would need to stay focused on one, Biden failed, and two, Iran funded." So again, right, to blame everything on Biden. That's the whole message. That's what we got to do. The Hegseth message goes on to state, quote, "Waiting a few weeks or month does not fundamentally change the calculus. Two immediate risks on waiting. One, this leaks and we look indecisive." It did leak. Two, Israel takes an action first or Gaza ceasefire falls apart and we don't get to start this on our own terms. We can manage both. We are prepared to execute, and I had a final go or no-go vote. I believe we should. This is not about the Houthis. I see it as about two things: restoring freedom of navigation, a core national interest, reestablish deterrence, which Biden cratered, but we can easily pause. And if we do, I will do all we can to enforce 100% OPSEC, Operation Security. I welcome other thoughts. A few minutes later, the Michael Walls account posted a lengthy note about trade figures and the limited capabilities of European navies. Quote, "Whether it's now or several weeks from now, it will have to be the United States that reopens these shipping lanes. Per the president's request, we are working with DoD and state to determine how to compile the most cost the costs associated and levy them on the Europeans. The account identified as JD Vance addressed a message at 8:45 to @Pete Hegseth. Quote, "If you think we should do it, let's go. I just hate bailing Europe out again." The administration has argued that America's European allies benefit economically from the U.S. Navy's protection of international shipping lanes. The user identified as Hegseth responded 3 minutes later. Quote, "VP, I fully share your loathing of European free trading. It's pathetic." But Mike is correct. We are the only ones on the planet, on our side of the ledger, who can do this. Nobody else even close. The question is timing. I feel like now is as good a time as any, given POTUS directive to reopen shipping lanes. I think we should go, but POTUS still retains 24 hours of decision space. At this point, the previously silent SM joined the conversation. Again, that's supposed to be Stephen Miller. Quote, "As I heard it, the president was clear. Green light, but we soon make clear to Egypt and Europe what we expect in return. We also need to figure out how to enforce such a requirement. E.g., if Europe doesn't remunerate, then what? If the U.S. successfully restores freedom of navigation at great cost, there needs to be some further economic gain extracted in return." Here's a screenshot. Oof. This one even have a picture? Man, it sure does. There's Pete Hegseth's picture right there. Okay. Wow. That message from SM, presumably Donald Trump's confidant Stephen Miller, the deputy White House chief of staff, or somebody playing Stephen Miller, effectively shut down the conversation. The last text of the day came from Pete Hegseth, who wrote at 9:46 a.m., "Agree. After reading this change, I recognize that this conversation possessed a high degree of verisimilitude. The texts and their word choice and arguments sounded as if they were written by the people who purportedly sent them, or by a particularly adept AI text generator. I was still concerned that this could be a disinformation operation or a simulation of some sort, and I remain mystified that no one in the group seemed to have noticed my presence. But if it was a hoax, the quality of the mimicry and the high level of foreign policy insight were impressive." It was the next morning, Saturday, March 15th, when this story became truly bizarre. At 11:44 a.m., the account labeled Pete Hegseth posted a signal, a team update. I will not quote from this update or from certain other texts. The information contained in them, if they have been read by an adversary of the United States, could conceivably have been used to harm American military and intelligence personnel, particularly in the broader Middle East, Central Command's area of responsibility. What I will say, in order to illustrate the shocking recklessness of the signal conversation, is that the Hegseth post contained operational details of forthcoming strikes on Yemen, including information about targets, weapons that the U.S. would be deploying, and attack sequencing. The only person to reply to this update from Hegseth was the person identified as the vice president. Quote, "I will say a prayer for victory," Vance wrote. 2 other users subsequently added prayer emoji. According to the lengthy Hegseth text, the first detonations in Yemen would be felt 2 hours hence at 1:45 p.m. Eastern Time. So I waited in my car in a supermarket parking lot. If this signal chat was real, I reasoned Houthi targets would soon be bombed. At about 1:55, I checked X and searched Yemen. Explosions were then being heard across Sana'a, the capital city. I went back to the signal channel. At 1:48, Michael Walls had provided a group to update. Again, I won't quote from this text except to note that he described the operation as, quote, "an amazing job." A few minutes later, John Radcliffe wrote, quote, "a good start." Not long after, Walsh responded with 3 emoji, a fist, an American flag, and fire. Soon others joined in, including Marr, who wrote, "Good job, Pete and your team," and Susie Wiles, who texted kudos to all, most particularly those in the theater and CENTCOM. Really great. God bless. Steve Witkoff responded with 5 emoji, 2 hands praying, a flexed bicep, and 2 American flags. TG responded, "Great work and effects." The after-action discussion included assessments of the damage done, including the likely death of a specific individual. The Houthi-run Yemeni Health Ministry reported that at least 53 people were killed in the strikes, a number that has not been independently verified. And here you have a screenshot. On Sunday, Walsh appeared on ABC's This Week and contrasted the strikes with the Biden administration's more hesitant approach. Quote, "These were not kind of pinprick back and forth. What ultimately proved to be feckless attacks," he said. Quote, "This was an overwhelming response that actually targeted multiple Houthi leaders and took them out." The signal chat group, I concluded, was almost certainly real. Having come to this realization, one seemed nearly impossible only hours before, I removed myself from the signal group, understanding this would trigger an automatic notification to the group's creator, Michael Walls, that I had left. No one in the chat seemed to notice that I was there, and I received no subsequent questions about why I left, or more to the point, who I was. Earlier today, I emailed Walls and sent him a message on his Signal account. I also wrote to Pete Hegseth, John Radcliffe, Tulsi Gabbard, and other officials. In an email, I outlined some of my questions. Is the Houthi PC small group a genuine Signal thread? Did they know I was included in this group? Was I, on the off chance, included on purpose? If not, Who did they think that I was? Did anyone realize who I was when I was added or when I removed myself from the group? Do senior Trump administration officials use Signal for particularly sensitive discussions? Do the officials believe that the use of such a channel could endanger American personnel? Brian Hughes, the spokesperson for the National Security Council, responded 2 hours later, confirming the veracity of the Signal group. Quote, "This appears to be an authentic message chain, and we are reviewing how an inadvertent number was added to the chain," Hughes wrote. Quote, "This thread is a demonstration of the deep and thoughtful policy coordination between senior officials. The ongoing success of the Houthi operation demonstrates that there were no threats to troops or national security." And also, we probably shouldn't have included a journalist from The Atlantic there. William Martin, a spokesperson for Vance, said that despite the impression created by the text, the vice president is fully aligned with the president. Quote, "The vice president's first priority is always making sure that the president's advisors are adequately briefing him on the substance of internal deliberations," he said. Quote, "Vice President Vance unequivocally supports this administration's foreign policy. The president and the vice president have had subsequent conversations about this matter and are in complete agreement. Please, Mr. Trump, please don't beat me up. I've never seen a breach quite like this. It's not uncommon for national security officials to communicate on Signal, but the app is used primarily for meeting planning and other logistical matters, not for detailed and highly confidential discussions of a pending military action. And of course, I've never heard an instance in which a journalist has been invited to such a discussion. Conceivably, Walls, by coordinating national security-related action over Signal, may have violated several provisions of the Espionage Act, which governs the handling of national defense information, according to several national security lawyers interviewed by my colleague Shane Harris for this story. Harris asked them to consider a hypothetical scenario in which a senior U.S. official creates a Signal thread for the express purpose of sharing information with cabinet officials about active military operations. He did not show them the actual Signal messages or tell them specifically what had occurred. All of the lawyers said the U.S. official should not establish a Signal thread in the first place. Information about an active operation would presumably fit the law's definition of national defense information. The Signal app is not approved by the government for sharing classified information. The government has its own systems for that purpose. These same people, remember, complaining about Hillary Clinton, complaining about private email servers, now doing shit like this? I digress. If officials want to discuss military activity, they should go to a specifically designated space known as a Sensitive Compartmentalized Information Facility, or SCIF. Most cabinet-level national security officials have one installed in their home, or communicate only on approved government equipment, the lawyers said. Normally, cell phones are not permitted inside a SCIF, which suggests that as these officials were sharing information about an active military operation, they could have been moving around in public. Had they lost their phones or had they been stolen, the potential risk to national security would have been severe. Hegseth, Ratcliffe, and other cabinet-level officials presumably have the authority to declassify information, and several of the national security lawyers noted that the hypothetical officials on the Signal chain might claim that they've declassified the information they shared. But this argument rings hollow, they caution, because Signal is not authorized venue for sharing information of such a sensitive nature, regardless of whether it's been stamped top secret or not. There was another potential problem. Walls set some of the messages in the Signal group to disappear after 1 week and some after 4. That raises questions about whether the officials may have violated federal records law. Text messages about official acts are considered records that must be preserved. Quote, "Under the records law applicable to the White House and federal agencies, all government employees are prohibited from using electronic messaging applications such as Signal for official business unless those messages are promptly forwarded or copied to an official government account," Jason R. Barron, professor at University of Maryland and the former director of litigation at the National Archives and Records Administration, told Harris. Again, the lawyer that a colleague, rather, that interviewed multiple national security lawyers for Jeffrey Goldberg before this article was written. Quote, "Intentional violations of these requirements are a basis for disciplinary action. Additionally, agencies such as the Department of Defense restrict electronic messaging containing classified information to classified government networks and or networks within government-approved encrypted features," Barron said. Several former U.S. officials told Harris and me that they use Signal to share unclassified information and to discuss routine matters, particularly when traveling overseas without access to U.S. government systems. But they knew never to share classified or sensitive information on the app because their phones could have been hacked by a foreign intelligence service, which would have been able to read the messages on the devices. It is worth noting that Donald Trump, as a candidate for president and as president, repeatedly and vociferously demanded that Hillary Clinton be imprisoned for using a private email server for official business when she was Secretary of State. It's also worth noting that Trump was indicted in 2023 for mishandling classified documents, but the charges were dropped after his election. Walls and other cabinet-level officials were already potentially violating government policy and the law by simply texting one another about the operation. But when Walls added a journalist, presumably by mistake, to his principals committee, he created new security and legal issues. Now the group was transmitting information to someone not authorized to receive it. This is the classic definition of a leak, even if it was unintentional, and even if the recipient of the leak did not actually believe it was a leak until Yemen came under American attack. All along, members of the Signal Group were aware of the need for secrecy and operation security. In his text detailing aspects of the forthcoming attack on Houthi targets, Hegseth wrote to the group, which at the time included me, "We are currently clean on OPSEC, operational security." Folks, this was stunning. I wanted to read you this article in its entirety. Again, you should check it out. I will include it in the comments. The Trump administration accidentally texted me its war plans by The Atlantic's Jeffrey Goldberg. This is stunning, a stunning breach of national security and of privacy and of government policy and of federal law, and a stunning display of unprecedented incompetence from the people who vowed to bring competence back to government. We've never seen anything like this from the Biden administration. The hypocrisy and the double standards are on full display, and people need to be talking about this. You need to be talking about this. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.